Hi, I'm Margaret Lyons. Roger, are you there? Can you see us?
Oh, I can see you. Hi, New York City.
Okay, because we want to bring out the rest of the American Fiasco team. Whenever you guys are ready.
Hi, Roger.
Hi, guys. God, you look good.
Would you guys like to fill us in a little on what these pajamas are actually representing to everyone?
I don't know what you're talking about. These are Everton pajamas. Everton, Roger, can you introduce Everton for people that don't know Everton?
They're a human darkness from Liverpool. They're a football team. You know, in life, there's a Yankees, that's Liverpool Football Club, and then there's the Mets, Everton Football Club, where losing is just a way of life, and happiness is a brief moment which should be celebrated and just savor every minute. That is Everton Football Club. All of you, have never looked better than in those pajamas.
Before we get started, can you guys just introduce yourselves too? I think people probably know Roger, who's the host of the podcast, but they might not know you guys.
Sure, I'm Joel Meyer. I'm the executive producer of American Fiasco.
I'm Dennis Brown. I wrote the music for the podcast.
Great. So we're going to talk. I'm going to ask them questions for a little while, and then we're going to throw it open to you guys. So if you have questions for Roger or questions for the production team about how American Fiasco got put together, start thinking of those, and we'll open it up in a little bit. So Roger, you already have a pretty successful soccer podcast. I'm curious how you decided, or when you decided, that you wanted to make another different podcast.
I've always wanted to make a story, and apologies for not being with you today. Unfortunately, the World Cup, I'd rather be with you than at the World Cup, but I'm in Moscow right now. Otherwise, I'd be sitting down with you in my pajamas in New York City, which would be amazing. But I came to America in the early 90s, and I always loved America. I grew up in Liverpool, just idolized everything that America stood for back then, which was largely kind of like Heart to Heart, The Love Boat, Fantasy Island, Miami Vice, Cagney and Lacey. And I longed to come over there and live a life there, which just seemed to be kind of like when you watch the movies of John Hughes, it just seemed like life was lived in color. And I was living in Liverpool in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher's Liverpool, where life was very much lived in black and white. And I did get over to America in the early 90s, right before the World Cup. And I saw this American soccer team in the 1994 World Cup on home turf, swagger onto the field in stonewashed denim jerseys and kind of ginger beards and mullets. And I just love them, just adored them. I'm from England. We hate ourselves. We're filled with self-loathing. And I'd only ever seen football players feel miserable on a football field. You're Americans. They just seem to love joyously playing together. And I was quite taken. And they left that World Cup feeling so confident that they were going to put the game on the map in America for the first time after decades of being scorned and hated and despised by the wider American populace. And then, you know, being American, they also thought, you know, we've just shown the world we can belong at the 94 World Cup. What are we going to do now? We're going to win. It's the most American thing ever, the most American thing ever. And I watched in horror as they did think they were going to win, charge towards the next World Cup in 1998 and just humiliated themselves with the world watching. And more importantly, with the American audience that was ready to fall in love with football. They didn't just lose, they humiliated themselves and lost it. Iran, who were then like the great Satan, America's great enemy. And I was just fascinated, even then, as a human story, how you can go from such collective confidence and joy and wonder to such self-inflicted, self-sabotaging hatred, where you kind of destroy the collective goal from within. And as soon as I saw it, to be honest, I wanted to make that show. It just took 20 years for me to find the truly remarkable team at WNYC, who were not wearing the pajamas that they're wearing right now, but I really admired them greatly. And they had the craft and the ability to really elevate the story and make it not a soccer story, which was really important to me, but a human story. A little bit like Animal Farm isn't just about horses and pigs. It's about a whole lot more than that. and I hope that American Fiasco is too.
Is that how he sold you guys on it?
Yeah, he was also like, if you finish the podcast, you'll get a pair of pajamas. So yeah. No, I mean, when I first heard about this project that Roger was coming to work at WNYC, I was really, really excited. I thought it was just such a perfect blend of what Roger is so brilliant at and what we've done with on-demand audio here in podcasts. It just seemed putting those two things together with a story that sort of is about soccer, but is about a lot more. It seemed like just sort of a really great combination.
How did you guys decide how to format it? So obviously or maybe not obviously, I don't know how many of you have listened to all the episodes, but the podcast goes chronologically, and that's obviously like a pretty standard way to tell the story, but it's not the only way. Like I thought maybe there would be like episodes that focused just on one player, or that zoomed all the way out and were like, soccer started in a billion years ago or whatever, How did sort of the structure and style come together? And Roger too, I guess.
I mean, Roger, I think we mapped it out. We knew that we wanted it to be a big story, and chronologically seemed like the most logical way to do it. But then nestled within each of the episodes is sort of a set piece about one player, I think.
And we also wanted to focus very much on the human decisions, Margaret, that led from just this moment of wonder where, I mean, you got to know, for decades, America was like space for Captain Kirk. It was the final frontier. Like the rest of the world lives and dies for this global eclipse soccer, which for 32 days, just the whole world is enraptured by this telenovela that is the World Cup. America couldn't give two craps. For 40 years, they didn't qualify for 40 years. No one cared. No one cared. In fact, they hated soccer, and I always found that fascinating. They almost protested too much with their hatred. And in one of the episodes, we try and understand, why did they hate? They didn't just not like it, but they truly hated it. They always hated it because they couldn't do what Americans love to do, which is win. Like the dream team, Charles Barkley elbowing an Angolan in the head while they're dunking and winning by 50 points, or winning like the Miracle on Ice, plucky underdogs. We did it again. Soccer is much harder. America couldn't do it. America hated it. And we wanted to focus on this team in the 20th anniversary of 1998, how they went from 1994, this unbelievable collective, to 1998, an awful, like Scarface meets Apocalypse Now kind of odyssey. And so in each episode, Margaret, we tried to focus on one single human decision that led to that unraveling. Because it's never like one moment. Like life is never that simple. It's always just one kind of awful human decision after another that leads to just like the pot on the potter's wheel just going completely awry in the potter's hands.
I'm curious if you guys see this as sort of a melodrama or a workplace drama, or if you think there's an aspect of it that's also a tragedy, sort of in like a grandiose sense, because I agree that I think the podcast is very much not just about soccer, and I'm curious sort of how literary you guys got when you were thinking about what kinds of stories to sort of, or how to sort of move the stories into like the most comfortable sort of narrative hold.
I mean, I think the workplace drama part of it, I really love. There's a moment in one of the episodes when Roger describes soccer teams like being like a workplace, and I think this is an example of just a really bad workplace. Where like it was good for a while when the company first started, and then sort of somebody got a really big head, and things like super went south, and then the company went bankrupt.
Are you saying it's a parable for Uber?
Exactly.
Just a thinly veiled
That's right.
retelling.
Right.
I think that one of the joys of the making of this program for me was to work with WNYC Studios and to work with a team of human beings who stretched the story. Like in the interviews, which took Joel, I mean, we were out in the field for about 7 months out in the field. We really did try and emphasize, which is very hard for elite athletes, thoughts and feelings. Thoughts, feelings, emotions, thoughts, feelings, emotions. Athletes are very, very good at saying, I got the ball and, about the 20-yard line, and then I kind of just saw Smithy ahead and he just did a great job, and the W is what's important. They're much worse at saying how they feel, how they think, what they thought in that moment. And we worked really bloody hard to try and to drill down as much as we could and make often emotionally inarticulate subjects, confident that they could be emotionally articulate, and then working with Emily and Paula, who I think are there tonight in pajamas, and Starlee Kine also, who really in the process of putting this show together stretched the storytelling to a place that I mean, I'll be honest, I learned so much from working with them. The questions that they asked, the narrative structures that they lace together, and I think that what was fascinating for me, going back to your earlier question about why another podcast, to work with individuals who are incredible, who are masters of narrative and storytelling, like Emily, Paula, and Starlee, was really what allowed that narrative to really hum, that framework to really hum.
Hannes, I want to talk a little bit about the score for the podcast because I think it sort of adds this like sense of grandeur and also like it sort of brings you along. It sounds different than music for other podcasts. You also score other podcasts. Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of style and tone of your work for this?
Yeah, it came pretty easily, actually. Joel reached out to me a few months before they were going into post-production. We knew it took place in the 90s, so having kind of a signifier, distorted guitar.
It was like, I want it all grunge.
Right.
And you do all grunge.
But we didn't want to timestamp anything. And so kind of like what Joel and Roger are saying about making it kind of human and epic at the same time as having this like kind of on the surface, a little bit maybe of a cartoonish bro-y thing. The entrances of all the characters is kind of like chunky guitar, blues guitar, or testosterone. And then generally the scores kind of move into more of like a slow motion, like kind of like the confusion of what might be in their head or the smell of blood, I guess, like victory.
You said something in our first conversation, which went something like this. Like, I talked at you on the phone for like 45 minutes explaining the story. And then you were clearly already thinking about what this was going to sound like. And you mentioned something in that preliminary phone call. You really hadn't even heard any of the rough drafts of the show at that point. That ended up being a really signature part of the show, which is you said something along the lines of like, I really can hear a lot of percussion during the gameplay. That either would be like a school marching band or something you were just thinking off the top of your head, but then, especially like I think in the episode that a lot of you listened to for tonight, but throughout the entire show during gameplay in the episodes, you can really hear percussion and sort of a marching band feel, and it really gave this cool signature sound for the gameplay part of the episode, so that you knew you were like, okay, this is no longer just part of the exposition. This is the game now. This is the action part of the movie.
You mentioned early drafts. I'm curious what early drafts look like or sort of what the major hurdles were from getting it, from its earliest stages to its final form.
I think one choice that we made early on, to go back to something that Roger was saying about how crucial Paula and Emily and Starlee were, the early drafts of the episodes featured a lot of gameplay. Like, there was a lot more soccer in the show early on. And I think it was the influence of those three people that, and then also when we sat down and looked at the interviews that we had and how great all of the conversations were, that this is a podcast that should be built around people talking about how they felt about this tragic thing that happened to them, and that we would focus on that and less on just recapping games and remembering what happened on the field.
Roger, do you remember any of the early titles for the show? Was it always called American Fiasco, or were there other options on the table?
I don't know if WNYC's legal team are there, so I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about what it was going to be called originally. But we had a name that we're all still wedded to, but I don't think it survived the legal vetting, which was Cluster FC. which would have been quite gorgeous, and would have made for an amazing football jersey, soccer jersey that no doubt we could have got Adidas to make, and it will be a name that will be used down the road. The coarser America becomes, but the American Fiasco ultimately was the consensus reality. I do want to say one quick thing about the music, which was genuinely amazing, and the amazing job that that Hanan did on the music being just the amount of detail. I've worked on a lot of documentaries where working with composers, they create a structure and it begins really strong, that structure, and then down the end of the film they're just plugging in the stuff that they've done the hard work and they're just plugging it in, and it's a lot of reprise. And I think what you did with the music, which is really carried the show, to be honest. There's so much of the show is a tough swallow. Why would someone want to listen to a show about soccer is really the question. And the early drafts that you were hinting at, there was so much exposition, it was almost unlistenable. And thanks to Starley and Emily and Paula, we really cut down the exposition and honed in on the storytelling. And this story is so incredibly human. It really is. It's such a human story for two reasons. These are not just guys who are trying to win a game. Like in England, you win, you lose. That's really the sport. At the end of the day, England's no better, no worse for winning or losing. These guys were fighting for their life, for their career. If they lost, they were going to set the sport back, the league back. At the beginning, they were getting paid $5 a day per diems. In the middle of the show, they're driving Lamborghinis, they've got jet skis, they've got horse farms. It's like that scene in Goodfellas where, the cartel's doing pretty well, the money's flowing in, they've got money, they're counting the money on paper, on counting machines, and it's like and then they lose it all. They really do lose it all. And that was the art we wanted to tell. And to a large degree, the music is so important. And you never phoned it in. To episode 7, 8, 9, the music keeps changing. The detail work that you put in with the composing, the tweaking, the detail, it really, to be honest, I think what you did with this, with the composing, I've worked on a ton of films. I've never worked with someone who's as talented as you, as creative as you, or as detail-oriented as you, and not just kind of settling. Episode 8, 9, and 10, the composer's always phoning it in, just taking the stuff from 1, 2, and 3, using a voice modulator. There you go, I'm done with this crap. The hard work you put in, really, to me, is the real star of the show.
I'm curious if you guys learned anything about the teams that you're on by working on this podcast. If anything sort of came up where you're like, I better keep an eye out for that, or that this informed anything about the way you think about, I don't know, how you get feedback or work side by side with someone. Did it sort of have any lingering effects on that front?
I think that there are a lot of people involved in this podcast. There's a reason that we got Bob Lee from ESPN to read the credits at the end of the show. Not only is he sort of a character in the story, but we needed somebody with like a really smooth voice to talk for like a minute, because there were so many people that we had to talk to, or that we had to mention at the end of the show. I think that, everything that Roger just said about Hannes taught me, working with Hannes taught me a lot about how important it is to have somebody doing original score. I've worked on other podcasts that did really well, but used production music, and that can be a little bit of a rockier road to take. We also had an excellent technical director on the show, Joe Plord, who's in the front row. He is kind of the silent hand in the show, especially in the final stretch of producing each episode. He would often take Hannes's music and then, with a really keen eye towards pacing, turn the show into something that, when it needed to move quickly and like sort of needed to make your heart race, he could do that. But then also, when things needed a different emotion, would take the time and let it breathe. I was just listening to a podcast this morning where I felt like there was no air in it, even though it was a really grim story. I think Joe was really good at knowing when there was air and time needed to be given in a certain moment.
For me too, because you spend all the time when you're composing by yourself in your living room for like 15 hours or something.
Wearing pajamas, much like this.
And like Joe basically like kind of co-composed it. Like I created all the music and then I would send him all of the elements of the music. And so he acted as like, we had sort of like a 2-step editing process where I would send it to Joe, who is a musician and a record producer when he's not here. And he was able to articulate like, this works or this doesn't, or I think we should do this. And then he would toss it to Joel, who actually used to be executive producer or senior producer on Soundcheck here. And so he knows a lot about music too, and they both are able to talk about music. Then I would send that to Joe, and the cuts were always changing on the fly. So Joe would then change Roger's pacing to match the music, or was able to like loop certain areas of it, just so that we didn't have to go back and forth like 20 times. We'd go back and forth like 3 times instead. So,
Margaret, the thing about the show that was personal for me that I learned, there's an episode where the team are panicking, and the manager and the team are just really, the friction's brutal. He doesn't trust any of the veterans. He gets rid of them all, and then he starts shopping for new talent, and he finds this foreign guy who's married to an American playing in Germany, and just brings him in out of nowhere and gets him a passport on the last possible day, and suddenly says, you're an American now, you can play. And this guy has always been maligned in football culture. His name's David Rage. Has always been maligned, not really American, should never have played. It was awful what happened. And we tracked him down and interviewed him. He's such a beautiful man. And to hear his story, where he talked about what it meant for him to become an American, to go through the citizenship process, what America meant in his imagination, before he became an American, after he became an American, when he pulled on that jersey for the first time and cried during the national anthem, and went on to have a solid American career. And I found that fascinating, because during the process of making American Fiasco, I became an American citizen. And in fact, the day we recorded the last episode, the very last episode, the pickups for it, I actually got sworn in down at the court downtown, and that was very moving for me. And there's always a debate about what a real American is, whether someone can become a true American, whether you have to have, there's still a debate for the soccer team. It's still a debate, massive debate in the country. And hearing him talk about, from his POV, this guy's been very maligned in American sporting culture, to hear his perspective, which echoes my own. Becoming American is it's the greatest thing I've ever done. And the greatest thing I ever will do, bringing my family over here and setting up life here. And to hear David Regi tell his story, like that's the thing that I was most moved by and take away most from the making of American Fiasco.
I think we're ready to sort of open it up. So there are people coming around with a mic, and even though the room is kind of small, can you wait for the mic, because we're streaming it on Facebook, so you need to be able to hear it. Does anybody have a question? Right over here.
Hello, thank you so much. I have 2 questions. One, was there any debate about using the word soccer versus football? That's one question. Second question is, I live in Taiwan now, and the big World Cup story in Taiwan is Iceland. And people really relate to the Iceland story. And so I was wondering about how are you seeing the Iceland story, quote unquote, being covered in many parts of the world?
Roger, I'll give the soccer versus football question to you.
Yeah, I just did a crazy show on CNN that I'd never heard of before, called Richard Quest Does Business or something. It's a big global show, and I was in the interview. It went all over social media, and at the end of the interview, I just said, to wrap the interview, I said, and America really is a true soccer country. And he stopped the interview and goes, "Ha ha! I got you!" I was like, "What did you get, mate?" And he goes, "You called it soccer." And I was like, "Yeah, but big deal." He goes, "I trap you." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "No one in the rest of the world would call it soccer." And I was like, "They really would. They really would." And the whole interview became him. Like, there's an English character called Alan Partridge, who's the world's worst television host. And I honestly felt like I was on with it. I said to him, "You've like come over like Alan Partridge, mate." And then I was like, "All right, you've won. You got me. But the honest truth is, in England, the show is called Soccer Saturday. In Australia, the national team are called the Socceroos. It's just a it's a piece of partial self-loathing that we don't feel adequate in the football world, and partially just a way for other football cultures to put America down. The honest truth is, soccer comes from the word association football. It's an abbreviation. It's an English word, an English term. And to me, I couldn't give two craps. Soccer, football, I love both of them. I love all sports. I'd watch if two horses were playing soccer. I love men's soccer. I love women's soccer. I love youth soccer. I love every single. I'd watch any of it. And what you call it ultimately doesn't matter. It's the feelings that the sport gives you about heroes, villains, life, death, success, loss. I mean, right now, just watching the World Cup and the telenovela worth of stories pouring out of that, which are just astonishing. That's ultimately what's important. When I watch soccer or football or soccer, I feel the feelings that I'm guessing most people feel in real life, but I'm totally numb to, like happiness, sadness, joy, misery. And we say on the show, Albert Camus, who before he became quite a good writer, was an unbelievably good goalkeeper, wanted to be a professional goalkeeper. That was his number one dream. He said something to the effect of, everything I know about humanity and the values and motivations of people, I learned through watching soccer, football, whatever the crap. It's the former that's important, not what you call it. It's the lessons, the storylines that are trapped in the thing. And the Iceland thing is astonishing. I love it too. I went out there 3 years ago and started to make films about the Icelandic national team. And for those of you who don't know the story, Iceland is 335,000 people. It's about as big as Corpus Christi, Texas. There's 20,000 registered soccer players. Rhode Island has more. And over the past 20 years, they've wired that whole beautiful island to make it a machine that produces elite footballers. They've invested a fortune in infrastructure, invested even more in unbelievable coaches. And I went over there, and they beat England they humiliated England at the last tournament just after I'd made this film. I've become very friendly with the manager, who's a dentist, a part-time dentist from an island which has 8 puffins for every human being. And I was like, what are you doing? Why are you still a dentist? You're an international football manager. His name's Heimir Hallgrímsson. And he said, some managers, it's very stressful being a manager. Some managers like to hunt. Some managers drink. Other managers gamble to blow off steam. He said, I like to do root canal. And so he's this charming guy. They're an unbelievable football team. They're in the World Cup. They just drew with Argentina. And the honest truth about how they're seen around the world and in Taiwan, in America, everywhere, is that they're now sick of their own narrative. Like, they've become a bloody good football team. They're a bloody good football team, however you cut it. And they're sick of being seen like the northern exposure of football teams. Like when I speak to them, they're sick. I'm sick of being called the dentist now. They hate being compared to Corpus Christi, Texas. They hate being told that they're cutesy little kind of Ewoks winning the battle for Endor. And they're a fascinating team because they're trapped by narrative right now, and they're a team that won't be seen for themselves, which is a great pound for pound, the best kind of footballer in the world. But everyone's just like dentist, cutesy videographer, goalkeeper. God, let's give them a cuddle. And so that's narrative trapping the reality.
Is there another question? Good. Over here? Or in the back? Yeah.
So it seems like one of the through lines through the entire show is that this wasn't just one thing that happened. This was a series of unfortunate events, to quote Lemony Snicket. But I'm curious, as you guys were making this, if you thought there was one decision that stood out above all the rest that led to an American fiasco. Like, what do you think was the biggest? What had the biggest impact on the failure of the U.S. and why?
I mean,
go ahead, Joe.
Okay, I mean, I think it's the benching of the veterans when that starts to happen. I think that creates the ill will inside the team that then gets compounded when John Harkes is sent off the team. I just think that created a lot of animosity that then was sort of bottled up and really went south. I think when Harks was sent off the team.
I think there's also an element of for me, like Americans are amazing. You guys, I mean, I should say we guys now that I'm American. So excuse me, we are amazing. That doesn't sound quite as good. I'm going to go back to you are amazing. You are amazing. You believe you can do anything. That's what's so astonishing. Like you put a Starbucks on every street corner. You put, a man on the moon. You guys just believe that all it takes is to put your mind to something, and then it's possible. And for me, like there wasn't one event I can put my finger on and say that was the moment. It was just more a mindset, which is the American dream is an amazingly powerful myth. And it's worked in some aspects of the American historic experience. The world football does not respect the American dream. You cannot just put your mind to it and be like, 1990, we showed the world we can qualify for the World Cup. 94, we made a noise and showed them we belonged. 98, we're going to go and win it. Football doesn't work like that. And it's the American, almost a naivete in this sense, where we didn't know what we didn't know, and just so many blind spots in this approach to world football, where we were really looking through the whole strategy of the 4 years through the wrong end of a telescope. It was more the mindset rather than any particular decisions, but the decisions were absolutely delicious. It was like Apocalypse Now, just people with too much money, too much equipment, and little by little they went insane.
I want to change my answer. It's in 1990 when they did the shirtless video on the beach. That was the terrible decision that everything else went downhill from there. I don't know if you guys have heard that episode, but the team decided to shoot a music video. They did the thing that teams did in the late 80s, early 90s when they were like high on their own supply, and they shot a music video shirtless on a beach. And then later in the video, go to a recording studio and hang out with O.J. Simpson. That was the beginning of the end. So that's my answer.
I think we have a question from one of our Facebook streamers, Jenna. Oh, I thought it was playing. My bad. She says, so much of my British footy fandom is about personality and narrative. To make footy truly America's sport of the future, do we need people in an MLS to be less normal? How do we make American soccer players and managers more ridiculous, more narrative-driven? Do we need our own Big Sam, Raz, Tim Sherwood, etc.?
Oh, that's such a good question. So you're talking about the Premier League, which is the most watched league in the world. It's where I grew up. I have to say, when I grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, when the Premier League began in the early 90s, it was crap. It was muddy. There were no foreigners. The most foreign person was like an Irishman. We were like excited. Oh, that's exotic. There's an Irish guy playing. It was the fighting, hooliganism. It was populated by people who loved the taste of their own blood in their own mouth. Football changes dramatically. Like Italy was where the best football was in the 90s. It was like, oh, wow, I want to go and play there. Football leagues change. The tectonic plates underneath them shift. And so MLS is only just over 20, the American league. It's not as buzzed about. It's not as hyped about. The other leagues in America, the NFL is bigger, the NBA is bigger. Soccer is now the third biggest sport in America for under 30s. They adore it, but mostly they're looking at the Premier League, the Champions League, the elite European games. And so the narrative is just intrinsically more interesting in England right now. By the way, the football is probably better in Spain. You could argue the football with Barcelona and Real Madrid is better than England. So it's not about the quality of the football. It is narrative. It is telenovela. It is a soap opera that's played out live. And all I can say in reaction to your question is I have seen with my own eyes over the past 25 years, England move from this muddy, dingy little backwater where when great Italian players got old and they had to move to England, the Italian journalists were sad for them. So sad that their careers come to this, that they have to play in England. That's where MLS was 5 years ago, but it's changing. And the American League is growing. It's growing incredibly fast. 72,000 fans go and watch the Atlanta team, Atlanta, on a regular basis. And the football culture here, well, I've been here, and we tried to bake this into American Fiasco, Margaret, to be honest. The narrative of 1990, the league was hilarious. It was pathetic, it was tiny, it was aspirational, it was weak, it was fragile. It has come so far, so fast, even in my lifetime. When I project forward, the answer to your question, the Facebook question, is give the American League 20 years, and I believe that it will be as the crazy guys in American Fiasco wanted it to be, but just 30, 40 years too late for them to benefit.
I believe.
Is there another question back there?
Great, thanks. I loved this podcast. I'm a lifelong player and fan, so it really worked for me on a bunch of different levels. I actually listened to the first 4 or 5 episodes a few weeks back on a drive up to the Catskills where I was playing in a tournament up there, and the guys were talking about it all weekend. And then on Sunday we got trounced by the team from Poland, so it was all very fitting. But my question is this: if you knew nothing of what this was about, just a soccer podcast called American Fiasco, you might assume it was about the 2017 experience. So I'm curious if that informed, if you saw any parallels, or if it sort of changed your perspective on the story of '98.
The timing couldn't have been better. Although, I mean, I
That sounded so super villain. It's like, it fell into our lap according to plan.
I'm the executive producer. No, I mean, Roger, when did you start talking about this project with WNYC? Was it before the loss to Trinidad and Tobago?
I think 1998 was the first time I had a meeting.
And then you just had to wait for podcasting to be invented.
Yeah, they told me to come back when I was properly bald. So I was very patient, and so were they. I sat down with WNYC in May, so way before the US were eliminated. And to be honest, my original intentions were to make a period piece that would show, as one of the through lines, how far soccer had come in America, that there were once these guys who failed terribly and now we're super cool. And it was pretty horrific, to be honest. Halfway through this bloody project for the US to crap the bed, it was dark. It really was dark, because suddenly the past played through into the present far more than I'd ever imagined. And I just say that one of the storylines that's most thrilling, I started to think about 98 because in 2014, the last World Cup, I did a massive oral history of the 1994 World Cup when I worked at ESPN, and it did massive numbers. I'm fascinated by history, sporting history, American history, and I believe there's an amazing soccer history that's just never really respected or given the light of day. So I wrote this 1994 oral history. It was massive, and it did huge numbers. It did what they call NFL numbers. People were really fascinated by it. So I swore that I'd do this 98 thing. And next year is the 20th anniversary of the US women opening a can of whoop-ass on the world in the 1999 World Cup, which is, again, one of the most glorious things I've ever witnessed. The Brandy Chastain penalty, shirt off, sports bra, product placement. An amazing human moment. And the thing that I love most, ultimately, that made me feel best about this show, because I felt quite dark at times once the US had failed in 2000 to qualify for the 2018 World Cup. And the thing that made me feel best and most optimistic again is that almost all the interview subjects from this American Fiasco, they all ended in the same way, which was, we thought we destroyed the game we loved. After the 1998 World Cup, the game of soccer in America, it was just a burning bag of crap. I mean, they really had destroyed this sport. It was about as popular as as competitive pogo sticking. And they all said the year after, 1999, the summer after, we watched with wonder as our women took to the field and destroyed all comers and made America love the sport again. And in 1999, it was the women that saved the men. And I do hope one parallel is next year is the Women's World Cup, or as I call it, the World Cup. And this is the Men's World Cup. And I hope the defending champion US women will do exactly the same in France next summer, which is to restore America's faith in its football teams. And one of my goals for next year is to do an oral history of the 1999ers, because that is a positive, glorious, complicated, wonderful story that's just as human.
I think we have a question over here.
Hannes, when you started describing your process with Joe, it occurred to me that I had absolutely no idea how that comes together. You said you sent him elements, and then Joe laid them in, which sort of made it sound like, you sent him a bass line and a melody and like a mellotron. Joe like created music from it. Can you talk a little bit about the matching of the narrative to the music and the process with an engineer who's also a musician?
Yeah. They're all kind of scored like short films. So as opposed to creating like a library of music that could be dragged to certain parts, I just had the whole podcast up in a single file, and I would just score emotionally or narratively, I guess, to that. The back and forth with Joe comes from the editing process was changing, as you know, because you make podcasts all the way till the very end. And Joe is a really good mixer, is better at mixing than I am. And so he's just kind of make it collaborative, if that makes sense. So I would send him them as like finished pieces of music, and then just be like, have a folder and be like, these are all the elements, just so you know. So here's just the drums. That way, Joe could be like, I think the drum should start 8 bars earlier and like fade in under the crowd noise. And it just gave us all more flexibility. That makes sense.
In the Google Docs, like this project was really built on the back of Google Docs for sure. And I would go into the script after Hannes had sort of turned in his music for an episode, and then Joe had gone through, and because they speak the same language and I speak like a caveman when it comes to music, they were communicating in ways that like I didn't understand, but usually it was just me adding a comment to that comment in Google that was like, that's good, that sounds good. And I would just be giving like, I was like, great, that's good. And like, because Joe's instincts, I think, were always really, really good about what needed to happen at a certain moment, definitely.
Yeah, it's really helpful when when Joe would be like, I really like this, but you're in Aeolian mode, and I think this would work better in Mixolydian or something like that. Whereas often if you're with like a filmmaker or someone, they'll just be like, it sounds too dark, but I'm not sure why it sounds dark. Could you make it brighter? But his directions, I could be like, I can fix that in like 1 second.
Yeah, it was then followed by a comment by me going like, that's right, Aeolian mode. Absolutely. Once again.
Classic Aeolian mode.
Can I say one quick thing about the music, which is like the hard part was for us to find the opening sting, and was it Crime Town? They used the track "Goat." Run to Your Mama. It's an amazing track, and it gave every episode of that show like an incredible kind of brand and just an emotional hook right at the outset. And we really struggled to find something from the top that could really engage an audience, and again signal that this is not just a football thing, but this is a safe place for all Americans who like human dramas. Come in, don't be afraid, be with us. And I think we were very lucky with this show that we were able to use some of Aaron Dessner and Bon Iver's music. We were lucky for 2 reasons. They just started a project, Red Machine, which is really beautiful, and they were very generous in giving us a chunk of the tracks months before they were even properly mixed, and we were able to select a couple, and they really propel. Hannes's work drives this thing absolutely and completely, but they really echo and reinforce all of the work that he and Joe did. We were very lucky for 2 reasons. Number 1, to have that music, the opening music, and then number 2, to have Bob Lee in the credits. If you've not heard Bob Lee, you've never heard the name Bon Iver be pronounced until it comes out of Bob Lee's lips. And I think it was you that said it, wasn't it? You said that Joel, you said it when he says Bon Iver, what did it remind you of?
It reminded me like he was at a French restaurant ordering wine off the menu at like the best French restaurant in Bristol, Connecticut.
And he was ordering the most expensive bottle. He was ordering the $25 bottle at Bristol, Connecticut. I'll have the Bon Iver.
Bon Iver.
I think I have a question right here.
As a longtime American soccer fan, I just want to thank you for telling the story, because I don't think that anyone would have ever told the story of this team. I listened to every minute of this series, although I couldn't listen to the Big Cat episode, because as a longtime American soccer fan, the tropes about why the sport is not as popular here are completely trite. And so I'm just kind of curious. I mean, Raj, you've come here, you've made a terrific show for yourself, you've introduced the sport to plenty of Americans, you've grown a lot of the enthusiasm for the game. Do you think we're at a point where these types of trite tropes about why and why and why will just simply fade away at some point?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and thank you for your kind words. I mean, it was a genuine honor to be able to tell this story. I do want to say that it's not something I take for granted. The opportunity to come to America and tell this wonderfully American story, this wonderfully, I mean, I love American history. I love soccer. To be able to have the opportunity to work with such a talented team as WNYC Studios and tell this story is not something that I do with and ever take for granted. And the response there has been amazing. I also am very grateful to the players and the manager and the coaches and everyone who opened up their lives and allowed us to come in and spend a lot of time asking questions that for many of them are still very, very emotionally fraught. So I feel very lucky to have had that opportunity. You know, one of the reasons I moved to Chicago in the first place was because of the work of Studs Terkel, who I found by chance when I was about 6 or 7 in England. I watched a crazy documentary about him and just fell in love with him, and then moved to Chicago and got the chance to work with him right before he passed away. So to be able to sit down with these footballers and allow them to have the room to tell human stories was beyond a thrill. But your question about like the hate, and I mean, soccer is such a complicated thing in American society. You guys love your sports. You loved baseball in the golden age of radio, when you'd sit around a radio and listen to the St. Louis Cardinals, probably while candles burned around the rest of the house, and then in came television, and you're like, NFL, yeah! And 28 cameras, and advertising breaks, and onion dip, and Budweiser, and it's all amazing. And you know, the NFL was made for television, and I think the internet has been such a powerful agent of change for the sport of soccer. You can connect now to Manchester United if you live in Montana as closely as you can if you live in the same zip code as the stadium, as close to Liverpool if you live in Los Angeles as a stone's throw from Anfield. And so the power of the internet, the power of EA Sports FIFA, this incredible game that has sensitized a generation under the age of 30 to the sport in remarkable ways. And when I first started to talk on television about soccer on Morning Joe 8 years ago, and I had no place to be on Morning Joe, but they just liked soccer at the time. And one of the first times I ever went on, and I wrote about this in our book, which just came out, Encyclopedia Blazotanica. One of the first times I was on, Tom Brokaw, they're like, tell us about the Premier League this weekend, Rog. I was like, well, Everton played, and Tom Brokaw cut me off, and he's like, whoa, 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 whoa. I was like, what? He goes, why are we talking about this? We're in America. We have the game of summer, the boys of summer. It's baseball season. Let's talk about that. And I watch this often, this clip, because, you know, I was going to like argue with him, but it's Tom bloody Brokaw, and at the time you didn't argue with him. It'd be like arguing, you know, with an elderly sage. And I just shut up on set, and he kept pounding away. It was a horrible 5 minutes of live television where I ended up just like putting my head down and just dying live. And I just left, and I said, I'm never going to go on with Tom Brokaw ever again on Morning Joe. And then 4 years later, they always cleared him off set if I came on, and I'd just be on with all the lovely people. And then one week I went on, and Tom Brokaw was still at the bloody table. I said, "Get Brokaw off. I'm not going on with bloody Brokaw. Not going on." And they're like, 10, 9, 8. And they're like, "Get on there." And I went on there, sat down, and I'm like, Arsenal playing less than... Tom Brokaw goes, "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa." And I was like, "What? What do you bloody want, Tom bloody Brokaw?" And he goes, "I used to hate soccer." And I said, "I know. I sometimes have nightmares about you crapping at my segment." And he goes, "But now I've learned to love it." And I was like, "What's happened, Brokaw?" And he said, "I have 3 son-in-laws, and every Christmas we go on a boys' trip. We go and watch 5 Premier League games together." And his kicker was, "And I fly coach." And I was so shocked. I was shocked. I was silent for 5 minutes. I was just so gobsmacked that even Tom bloody Brokaw likes soccer now. That, to answer your question, when we have Tom Brokaw liking soccer, we've kind of got a massive audience here. And that's where you've got to. So yes, the hate is burnt away, and the tropes of like the old cliches are burnt away, but they were incredibly powerful, and it took a long time to deconstruct them and to revisit them, I think, and to understand why they were there and what it means is an incredibly important task.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Well, in that case, Roger, how's everything? Oh, sorry, is someone over there? I didn't see you. No, I didn't see you. Sorry.
So following up on the women's soccer football situation, why do you think the whole time it's been so successful yet so unpopular? I mean, I don't remember what podcast it was, but the one where they talk about alternate histories and what was it, if Title IX never existed? And they're like, well, it'd kind of be the same thing, even though, Brandy Chastain and...
is it upon further review, the Mike Pesca podcast?
Yeah, I only listened to the Nixon one, sorry. So I'm just wondering, why? Because the women have been complete bosses on the field, like the entire time, but no one cares.
Do you want me to answer that one?
I think so, yeah. I kind of have an answer, but you go ahead.
I'd love to hear it.
No, after you. I'd say it's such a hard question to answer. I mean, that was with this project. That was always something that was something that was in the back of our minds, where we're sort of like, we're telling the story about the men's team and this total implosion and self-destruction, but there's also this other story with the women's team, just like what you're pointing out. I mean, I think, Roger, you've talked a little bit about how Title IX has made the women's teams so successful here compared to other teams in international soccer, although there are other teams that have caught up to them. I don't know. I would want to hear your answer, Roger.
So Title IX or not Title IX, the reality is women play soccer here, and they, until recently, played very little in other parts of the world. So Title IX really supercharged everything here. You had elite athletes who were being invested in, trained, coached, housed, and a whole system designed to develop masses with volume and really select the elite players from across the country, to invest in them, target them. So America, I mean, just destroyed all comers. They were faster, they were stronger, they out-physicaled them. When I grew up in England, it's one of the most glorious sporting stories of my lifetime. Is really the rise. When people say, is it the rise of the Premier League, the English? It's not for me. It's really not. It's the rise in profile of the women's game, which was a marginal backwater. It was derided. It was mocked. We were every kind of awful misogyny, chauvinism, just awfulness. We're very good at that in England. It's frightening, awful. And the women's game in the past 20 years has made leaps and bounds to where there's really now a professional league, not just in England, but in France, in Germany, in Japan, in parts of South America now. And these women are fighting unbelievable battles against not sporting opponents, but just everything that is the worst of humanity. And thank God they're winning those battles in country after country. And what it means for the women is that the US are still physically, athletically better than the rest of the country. But there's teams like France, Germany, England now, glorious, glorious England, where the coaching level is actually better than the American level. And so you have fewer people playing in those countries in Europe, but they're technically better, mentally better. They play a game which is far more complex and complicated. And so the success of the game in the world is actually a challenging prospect for the US women's team. Right now, not to bore you, but they've always played this dominant, hard-hitting, physical, we're going to outrun you, outfit you, out-bully you, we're going to crush you. And they're trying, as we speak, to prepare for 2019 World Cup and learn a different game where they can control the ball, they can possess the ball, they can do better than the Europeans, what the Europeans currently do better than them, which is what's going to make the 2019 Women's World Cup so wonderful. And it's one of the biggest challenges in sports. The numbers for the Women's World Cup, both the crowd numbers, the TV ratings, they're phenomenal. Commercially, the Women's World Cup is massive in America. And the challenge now is to work out how to make week to week the club football, the women's club football, as economically sound, and to have because a gap between club football where they get, a couple. I was just in Portland. We're playing these live shows during the World Cup, Men in Blazers. They have 17,000 fans going to watch their women's team every week. It's amazing. It's amazing. It's the best watched women's team of any sport in the world. And we need to get the rest of the clubs in America at that level, and then you really will see change in the women's game. But I believe it can happen. I really want it to happen. I know a lot of people, including us, are working on it. But please God, the future for the women's game will be one that your question hints you want it to be too.
Unless anybody has one last question. So when people came in, we asked you to record a confession in the confession corner about things that you were a super fan of in honor of this very super fan oriented podcast. And so we're going to play a clip now of what some of you said you were super fans of.
I'm a mega fan of reckless white guy nature shows. I feel like I'm super educated, but I'm super on the edge of my seat at the same time. Like, oh my God, is he really gonna stick his hand in that hole? Like, what's gonna happen? Is he gonna die? Is the river monster gonna eat him up? Like, I'm so glad he's doing it so I don't have to.
I am a mega fan of humility in sports and in everything that we do in life. One example during this World Cup season is Landon Donovan's defense of his support of the Mexico team. That's the kind of statements that we need in this world.
I'm a mega fan of cats. I think they're amazing animals and they're evidence of intelligent design.
I am a mega fan of soccer at every level. I can get as excited watching a U8 game on a local field as I do watching the World Cup.
Moscow Mules.
I am a mega fan of Jenna Wortham from the podcast Dope Processing, and I wish that she was here. I can't believe that I'm going to be in New York for an entire week, and I may not see her, so I'm putting it into the universe that I love her. I'm a big fan of the show, and a mega fan of the show, and I would love to meet her.
I am a mega fan of professional wrestling. I've been watching it ever since I was a child. I still watch it to this day. I went to a show at the Barclays Center and I cried when one woman won the title for the first time ever.
I am a huge fan of Avatar: The Last Airbender, such that I was almost going to get a PhD and write my dissertation on it. Luckily, I did not because I actually don't like teaching, but I
am a mega fan of science and hip hop.
Those are some great mega fandoms, you guys. That was so cute. So I want to thank Roger, obviously, for joining us all the way from Russia. We hope you're having a good trip. I want to thank all our guests from American Fiasco and our hosts here at the Green Space, and thank all of you for coming out. Podcast Club is going to be on hiatus for the rest of the summer, but we'll be back in September, and we'll hope to see you then.
Good night. I'm a mega fan of WNYC Studios.